couple more slides. Just so, anyway, I put these up more just to give you ideas and thinking about things. So you need to have a picture of what's going on. We've drawn some pictures here to think about the markets and the way it works. And we talked about, this is really a couple of the theories that go on behind financial markets. I talked about this basically, I'll go back, I'll clear this board here. So we're basically looking at what I call a continuum. So we could have a continuum between what we, and at one extreme I'll put in no regulation. So we don't have any regulation, probably no government or anything. So that's an extreme point, it's just theoretical. Then we have complete regulation. Now you can think of that as being some kind of Stalinist or total dominating state. Again, doesn't exist in the real world. So somewhere along this spectrum, between having virtually none to having limited regulation and having fairly complex regulation, is the real world. And it varies from time to time. So historically, you know, we probably had a lot of regulation, or some regulation. Then in the 1970s and 80s, through Thatcher and Reagan and others, influenced world opinion. We moved down this path here. And so we can see sort of the history is, you know, maybe I'll just draw from the 70s, going in this direction, into the 80s, 90s, 2000s. And maybe we're coming back this way now a bit. I don't know. But I sense that we are getting more regulation, and institutions are getting stronger, governments are getting more control. But that's not an over and done. There's certainly going to be forces coming back this way too. People don't want regulation. It's costly. We've just seen it in Australia. And it's what's happening in Europe and elsewhere, the US. Governments have big deficits these days. They're going to cut back their budgets. One of the things they'll do is cut back some of these things. They'll probably keep some of their social welfare, and they'll leave these guys to themselves. So this is sort of a trend. So we've got a free market philosophy versus a regulatory model. And the reason we tend to get regulation coming in, going back this way, is whenever there's a market failure. So I drew this as though it was a one-way thing, but it's probably more like that. So, you know, so we got the 70s, we got less regulation, then we had probably we have a dot-com boom and bust, and then we've probably had an Asian crisis here. That's pretty bad writing. Asian crisis, and then, you know, then we've had a GFC up here. So whenever we get a crisis, we tend to go back, we'll have a bit more regulation, then it weakens again. So it's a zigzag, up and down. And some countries are more free market, and the Americans like to think, oh, we're out here free market, but the Americans actually are very big regulators. And if you did you ever look at a US university before you chose to come to study in Australia? Some students shop around the world, think, oh, I'll study here, there, everywhere. Pretty smart coming to Australia. How big's our corp law? About that big. How big's our tax law? About that big. You go to America, study the Securities Industry Act. Okay, SEC. I'll tell you a little story. A few years ago, I worked for the Asian Development Bank in Vietnam. We were advising, as you do in this kind of work, on Vietnam. Well, it still is a communist country, but Vietnam was opening up its markets through Doi Moi, their opening up philosophy, and privatising a lot of their companies, their state-owned companies. and we were advising the government of Vietnam, the Securities Commission, on how to regulate their market, how to establish the stock market. And I was in a group, we had a lot of Americans, Canadians, we had some Europeans, and I was the only Aussie in my group at that time. And the Americans had come in, I'm from the SEC, and they get their big trolley and wheel it in. This is the SEC rules and regulations. The boxes and boxes of, this is what you should have in Vietnam. I'm going, you guys are crazy. These guys barely know the market. You just need simple laws. So again, what kind of law is applicable in a country depends on its stage of economic development, stage of transformation. So emerging markets don't need complex laws. America's a very sophisticated market, has very complex stuff. Sure, they might need truckloads. So students travelling around the world getting qualified, if you're studying in accounting or finance and business, America's a hard place to go and study because you have to learn a lot more stuff than you do even in a country like Australia. Okay, that's a little aside. But this just shows you regulation and quantification and how it impacts on learning. Generally, the pro-regulators and the governments tend to be more happy to regulate whenever there's an economic problem, like, oh, I'm going to fix it up, that kind of thing. And then we've got different approaches to what happens when we do regulate. So when we've got a regulation, the government might say here, it's really a more pure sort of notion that we regulate, and when these crises come about, because we've got some sort of market failure. Something's gone wrong in the markets, it hasn't worked efficiently, effectively, as our theory tells us, so we need to intervene to fix up the market. It's not quite right. Now the government might say, oh, we're doing all this in the public interest, we're going to set up a regulation. So you set up a regulation, and you're moving out on one of these tracks up here, and along the way you'll set up, as we talked about earlier, a government agency. Generally in our field, in the accounting finance area, will be some kind of securities commission. So in the US, it's called the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC. In Australia, we've got ASIC. And likewise, you can go around the world and you don't have to memorise all the names, but it's just useful to know there's something like this. Every country's got one. Every country. China's got the China Securities Commission, hasn't it? I think it's called Yung.
Yeah.
China Securities Commission. Yeah. They look after the stock markets in Shanghai and Shenzhen. In Vietnam, it's called the State Securities Commission. So each country's got its own securities commission. This is the primary agency that intervenes and looks after. Now the question then is, who can regulate securities? Who is good at it? Who knows what's going on? Who do you think runs a hospital? Who? Not government. They are going to run a hospital. Who do you think would run a hospital or a health commission? Who runs the airport corporations or the airlines?
Companies.
The answer to the first question is doctors. Who runs universities? Lecturer, yeah, professors, okay. So we can go around everywhere. Who runs any government agency, particularly oversighting education? Generally they're educators, people either from the high school...
Oh, in general, yeah, but still government. No.
What I want you to understand is that
okay.
When we look at who runs the airline safety and all that, there's got to be somebody who knows what's going on. You don't want me running airline safety, I hope.
Yeah.
You want a pilot. I want a pilot. If I got a doctor running a hospital, I want the doctor to say this is the best way to run this hospital, organise it. I want a medical guy to run the hospital. Who do we want to run our military? Hopefully it's a soldier. I don't want some guy that doesn't know. Okay, we can go all around the world. Who runs securities commissions? People who know about financial markets. These guys that run this are going to either be lawyers, accountants, auditors, bankers, whatever. Nobody can run a securities commission who doesn't know. This is very, very complex stuff. Probably far too complex. These guys don't even know. We've made things very complex. The point of all this is we call this regulatory capture. Okay? Nobody knows how to fix these things up except the people who make the messes in the first place. So even if a doctor kills a patient, who goes and investigates? Another doctor. They figure out, oh, that's the way it happened, you know. No, I can't go and investigate a medical malpractice. It's another doctor. Same here. So we've got people from the industry who investigate or control, and likewise in government agencies. Everybody here is usually been in the industry. So when the GFC came along, the Secretary of Treasury was Paulson, and Paulson was the previous, I think it was Salomon Brothers. Anyway, he was the chief executive of one of the big investment banks, who then becomes the chief government guy to fix up the mess. Okay, we can go through Australia or any other country. You will find these groups, these agencies, and these advisory boards, whatever, are people who know. So when I said before, in Australia we've got ASIC, and then under ASIC we've got CARMAC, and AA, SB, etc. These kind of bodies. Who are on these? These are generally people who are lawyers, accountants, or other qualified people. Now, normally in all of these organisations around the world, they might have a professor from a university, because professors generally know something about their field, and they will say, yeah, we can have you for your expertise. But they will not always have practical insight knowledge. They might have theoretical knowledge, but not practical knowledge. So in order to understand all the intricacies, we get this notion. Now, over time, through lobbying, through how do you get appointed onto these committees, how do you get appointed to these high-level government positions, is through lobbying. You influence, influence, influence. And over time, we generate, and so we have a very strong theory of what we call regulatory capture. Who runs the transport system, the oversight of road freight transport? It's the road industry. Who runs the agriculture and health service? The agricultural industry, the health industry, all captured. So no different in our field of accounting. So these are some of the theories you may need to think about and look at, how all this works, how independent is it. So you might say the government, but the government doesn't act with its own sort of free will because it doesn't have one. It's got to get advice from somewhere. Who advises, who shapes the opinion, how they do that. And then the government in turn will have its own philosophy. So in Australia, this is for Australian politics, and we can look at US and you can think of your own countries. We have two major, we call left and right. Everywhere in the world it's generally in the same line, different names. We have a Labor Party, notionally left, a Liberal Party, notionally right. One party tends to be more regulation, oh, we will look after the worker, we are against the big company. The other one, oh, we are for the big company, we don't want regulation. So generally, this divide here tends between pro and free or low regulation and high regulation, tends to be also a political divide. Okay? But sometimes politics doesn't count because sometimes these crises happen when you're on the other end of a point, and whoever's in government at that time has to respond. So governments do get caught having to enact regulation, even though their fundamental philosophy is maybe low regulation. Now, there's a lot of other theories that drive regulation, and these are really interesting. I'll talk about some of them. One of the big things that's shaping the world right now is globalization. You know, this is talked about day by day, all around the world, globalization. Why is that important for finance? because money has no border. You want to get on an aeroplane and go somewhere, you've got to get your passport. You want your dollars to go somewhere, you sit on a keyboard and bang, they're in New York, they're in Zurich, they're in Singapore, they're in Hong Kong. Doesn't matter where. Bang, bang, bang. Money travels without borders. Every day, trillions of dollars get moved around the world. No borders, no control. And so, as we get more internationalisation of investment, and particularly trading platforms, 24-hour trading platforms, integration of global stock markets, we've got groups like IOSCO, the the International Organisation for Securities Commissions. So IOSCO is the big body that oversees all of these. So all the world securities commissions, you can go and have a look up the IOSCO, International Organisation for Securities Commissions, the IOSCO website. That's the body. That's the really powerful body. That's a global organisation. And we've got other big bodies that feed into. IOSCO is the one that directly looks after that, but the big political, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, and then we've got the G20 and other power groups, APEC and other clusters, all influencing internationalisation. They're all knocking down barriers. Every country saying, we want money to come into our country, we want low levels of financial regulation. Now, counterpoint to that, one thing that did come up, of course, is global terrorism. And so we've now got through IOSCO and through these groups quite a lot of control over international money flows as a result of the 9/11 sort of incident in the US and things like that. Been a very big response. So managing and tracking down global money flows is a full-time government job. It's done by securities agencies like CIA, FBI, the Federal Police in Australia and other groups, constantly monitoring international money flows. You've got disclosures, anything over $10,000 must be reported for money laundering purposes. So moving money illegally around the world is very difficult, but that doesn't stop billions of dollars. So you've got this sort of counterpoint. Governments have this flow, but they don't want this to go to terrorism groups or illegal activities. So internationalisation is a really complex area. There's a lot going on there. It's a very interesting area to work in. Now the other point there is that the fundamental philosophy behind all this is that we want everyone who invests in the market, this is a philosophical point of view, to have a fair, equitable trade. That's why we don't have insider trading. I told you the story about Reuters and establishing the news service with Napoleon. If you can get news to the market first, you're going to be a winner. You can either buy or sell depending on whether it's good or bad news, and make a lot of money that way. And so that's a philosophy that everybody should be the same. Now, the point is that nowadays, there's a big gap. You've got the big hedge funds and the big investment banks that move billions and trillions of dollars on a daily basis, and it's all managed through computerized trading systems and algorithms. So this notion of mums and dads or the ordinary small investor is pretty much, that's a bit like an ancient history. They don't really play a big part and they don't have much. The big guys know what's going on anyway. The little guys are going to get screwed no matter what. And it's very hard to have this equitable treatment for all investors. Mainly because the little person might only have $100 or $1,000, some trivial amount. The other guys are putting in $1 billion. It's just, they can change the markets overnight. So, but this is a fiction that still remains. We still have this notion that all investors should be treated equally. And we have, of course, very strict insider trading rules. So people get kicked out or put to jail, in fact, if they are convicted of insider trading. And some of that came out of the financial crisis too. Some people knew there was problems coming, got out early and they said, look, you guys have inside knowledge, you're going to jail for 5 or 10 or 20 years. Bernie Madoff got 150. No, Bernie? He had the big scheme in New York, swindled everybody. So you've probably seen most of the Hollywood movies, have you? All the Hollywood actors, oh, I got enough. But they can go and make another movie, get 20, 30 million a movie. So they lose 50 or 100 million in one deal, they'll make it back in the next movie, won't they? So we don't feel too sorry for them. But some of them are. But they put Bernie to jail for 150 years for his scheme. Okay, weaknesses of financial reporting, classic, and then fraud and corruption. Well, Madoff clearly is in there. He cooked the books, made up the numbers. They were fiction, and everybody believed him. What we call a Ponzi scheme. You know what a Ponzi scheme is? You better write it down, P-O-N-Z-I. It's named after a guy in the 1930s, so another little bit of history, but it's played over and over again. There's hundreds and hundreds and thousands. Everybody gets sucked in by Ponzi schemes. What you do is you say, I'm going to offer you 20 or 30% return on your investment. And everyone, oh, it's a great deal, you know. Okay, I'll invest all my millions in you. Just made a big Hollywood movie, I got paid my $50 million fee. Here's this money. Now, what you do is you get all this money in and you say, I'm going to offer that. But in order to make that scheme successful, what you have to do is get more investors. They say, oh, he's paying 30, 40%. Now everybody else is paying 20%. We'll keep it. So every time you get new money in, you pay out that to the old guys. So it all depends on more money coming in all the time. Okay? Ponzi scheme is based on you paying the new investor from the old investor's money. You don't actually do any investing yourself. And so the scheme grows and grows and grows, more money comes in, but eventually you run out of people. Now the classic case of this is a company called Equity Funding. Equity Funding was an insurance company in the US in the 1980s, and Equity Funding was California based. It was one of the early great frauds of computerized accounting systems. Equity Funding started to grow, and at one point was the 6th biggest company in the US. So it grew very big, very successful. But what did it do? It started to make up false insurance policies. Okay? And how do you make a false insurance policy? Well, you have to hide it from people. But what the insurance companies do is they sell those insurance policies off to reinsurers. They get their money back in. So if I can say, there's only 3 or 4 people in this room, but if I said, oh, there's 20 people here, this student, make them all up. How do you do it? Oh, you go and find dead people. Equity Funding started insuring dead people, making false claims, deciding that they were actually there. They hid these from the auditors by putting a code against all the dead people in their insurance. So the auditors could never, every time they went into the computer system to search, only came up with live people. All the others had codes on their names or on their insurance numbers that never got revealed to the auditors. So over time, Equity Funding is insuring more and more people. And everyone's, oh, this company's growing 50% a year, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. As I said, got to be the 6th biggest company in America, all on a fiction. There's a great movie about that, again a Hollywood movie, showing these guys. They made up fictitious financial reports. Became very rich, but then they all went to jail afterwards. A few of them did anyway, all the bosses. A great computer fraud, classic one. Corporate fraud is full of really fascinating cases. Another great one is the company. In the early days, people couldn't make up accounts all the time. In the US, one of the classic ones is the Great Salad Oil Swindle. And of course, Equity Funding, the reason it actually got busted was they got so big, they actually had insured everybody in America. And if they kept growing at the rate they did, they would have insured everybody in the whole world within 2 or 3 years. And nobody figured it out. It's again, nobody saw the iceberg. I talked about the iceberg this morning. They all looked at, oh, they're showing this, growing. Nobody said, hang on, these guys have got everybody covered. They've already insured, they got so big, they've insured everybody. Same thing happened with Bernie Madoff. Same thing with that salad oil swindle. How does oil and water mix? Does it mix? What happens?
Yeah, it disperses.
What happens to oil and water?
Yeah, water is on bottom and also.
Okay, very good. Now, if you're an auditor and you've got one of these, you know, these giant tanks that you see in you know, that hundreds of thousands.
Oh, that's what they do.
What?
Did they put water in the bottle?
Hey, you're a good person, aren't you? You know how to fraud. You're going 101 in fraud, 201 in fraud, doing great. Okay, the great salad oil swindle is a great case of auditors ticking the box. Tick, tick, tick. They come along. This is in New Jersey, in US, in the 1930s. They produce oil, like canolas and oils, salad oils, so they're vegetable oils. Now they're in New Jersey, and what they're doing is producing oil from the Midwest, the US, the grain belts. They produce all the oil, they put it in there. Now the company needs to get a bit more profit, so they can boost their inventories and do a few things like that. But what they started doing, putting some seawater right next to the port, because the big ships come in, they fill it up with oil, send it over all around the world, and pump the seawater in. The auditors come in to these big things, they climb up the ladders, get to the top, put the big dipstick in, comes up, oil's up to here. There's, 100,000 litres or 1 million litres in this tank, and they go to the next one, they go to the next one, they go around all these big tanks, there's 1 billion. In the end, they had more oil in their storage tanks in New Jersey than was the salad oil production for the whole world. Nobody had sat down and said, look, we've got X billion litres of oil here. Nobody said that. They said, they've got all this oil. They've got big inventory, a very valuable company. We'll invest in them. Nobody said, well, hang on. What's the vegetable oil production of Canada, America, Australia, Europe, Russia, whatever, tick, tick, tick. These guys have gotten a lot. Nobody did the math. Now, this happened in the 1930s, salad oil. We saw it happen with equity funding. We also saw it with the GFC. Companies had more and more derivatives over more and more instruments than the value of the global economy. So fraud, looking at those icebergs out there, looking at the big picture, it's happened many, many times. So the history of financial fraud and deception is very interesting, lots of great cases. We talked about the political response. Governments want to feel, and you see pictures of prime ministers and treasury, I'm on the steering wheel, I'm running the economy. How many prime ministers say this? I'm in charge. Barack Obama's trying to get re-elected. I'm in charge of the American economy, we're driving it forward, we're going to get more jobs, more growth. Political leaders want to be seen to be in charge. And all this, if we can fix all this up, everyone says, we've got confidence, everybody feels happy. All the electors, the voters, you guys go and get jobs, I can retire, very good, everyone's got money, we all feel safe. So we want confidence in financial markets. There's some of the arguments if we can do it all right, but there's just lots of games out there. And we talked a lot about these things already. So I won't go, as I said, I didn't want to just go through slides, I would rather talk about all this in general. But we talked about the political and legislative institutions earlier, the different administrative and governance oversights, and the self-regulatory bodies. Keep in mind there's many layers. There's international layers. These are really important today. Once upon a time, it was each country did its own thing. So in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. But it wasn't really until the 1960s we start to get people, and then it was only small groups. In Europe, there's a classic case. We had at the end of the Second World War period, the beginning of the European Union. So we had the European Economic and Steel and Coal Associations, which eventually turned into European Commission and then European Union. And so over time we've had countries working more and more together. We've got APEC, we've got the African groups, we've got South American, Latin American groups, and then we've got these multilateral and bigger groups like World Bank, OECD, G20, IMF, lots of groups working together, all playing some part of the regulatory space, all trying to influence countries, and countries also trying to say, I'm doing what the IMF says, or I'm doing what the World Bank says, therefore I'm a good guy or a good country, and you should invest in my country. Your investments will be protected and safe. So the globalization that started in the 1950s, 60s, really accelerated through the 70s, 80s and 90s, and now it's pretty much given. Nobody really criticizes globalization anymore. And so we're seeing this merging of standards, accounting standards, We had the IASB established 2001. And so we have much more commonality. But by no means is everything the same. That's the critical thing. More sharing, but not uniform global. And I don't think it ever will be. It's a bit like our languages and our cultures. They're always going to be a little bit different. So when you move from one country to another as an investor, the message is you must know the business environment in which you're dealing and its cultural norms. I talked about a lot of these things earlier also. This is really from an Australian perspective, looking at some of the political elements. So again, these are important things. You don't need to really understand them all, but they're changing. These are all the different layers. How do you influence a politician? How do you get items on a political agenda? An agenda setting and shaping of agendas is really important. So most governments are controlled, particularly in the Westminster system like Australia. The governments have their planned agendas because they've got to get elected every 3 years, or in some countries every 4 years. So they know what they're going to do. They know when the good time is to bring in legislation, when the bad time is. Sometimes if there's a crisis, an economic crisis, currently the Australian government's responding to a people smuggling boat crisis, so they have to do things, even if they don't want to. They're going to fix up some problems as they come along. But there's an agenda and a plan, and usually the parliamentary whips set those agendas. They're discussed in cabinet. They know the timing. So when I worked in my involvement in government, we were told in advance we'd sit down with the minister or the parliamentary secretaries, and they would say, we are planning to introduce this in the second session of Parliament in this year. Therefore, they'd work back, we need these reports done by this date, we can do it this time, and then we can bring it into this legislative framework, and this is the timetable, and we'll present it under. So there's a lot of detailed back planning and political agenda setting. And that's all worked through government, cabinet, and usually coordinated through the Prime Minister's department. They want to know what all the ministers are planning and doing, and things like that. So there's a lot of interesting stuff there. And again, that's an area you can go for in accounting work, to understand the political and legal frameworks. Then there's all the detailed legislation and regulation. And then, as I mentioned with the Sons of Gwalia case, you get High Court decisions, governments have to respond and things like that. Now I mentioned some of these. These are our key regulatory agencies in Australia. You need to be familiar with those. You've done a lot of these things in other courses. So you need to know what all of these are regulated under the Corporations Act. So every one of those has a legal framework. They are constituted bodies. There are people appointed. They've got special terms. They're responsible for particular activities under the corporate law. And so these organisations are the actual institutional groups that make the regulation of accounting happen in Australia. And each country will have something like this. They may be different in some form in name, but they're going to be all doing something similar to regulate their security markets. And one of the key things I've learned over time is the tensions that exist between different organisations. These things aren't written down in textbooks, but there's competition. And we know the treasurer is usually in most countries, the treasurer is the Prime Minister or President is number one, and the person who's in charge of the money is usually number two, but in some military type regimes, it's usually maybe the head of the military, the General Chief of Staff will be number two in the government behind the President, who's notionally always the head of military anyway. The President of the US is the Chief of the US military. But usually the commander or the Defence Secretary or whatever you might call them is pretty high up, and in some countries may supersede the treasurer. But in most democracies that aren't military, the Minister of Finance or the treasurer or whatever is the second most powerful person. So they are going to build these kind of relationships because they can influence every other arm of government. Everybody relies on the money from the government. Every other minister, whether it's housing or aged care or health or education or whatever their ministry's for, they've got to get the money from the government to do their activity, and they have to account for it and report back and do all those things. So what we've seen is the merging of government accounting and private sector accounting. One of the big trends that's occurred in the last 20 years in particular has been a move to turn the accounting practices of the private sector into practices for government accounting as well. So these bodies influence both all forms of accountability. Some countries, like the US, has separate accounting for government accounting office, and they also may have separate accounting practices critically for the military. In the US, they have separate accounting for defence contractors, and in some countries that I've worked in, the army or military may have separate financial relationships and run a separate budget to the government. So they will run independent monetary policy for their activities. Now that is not common, but it does happen, particularly in some of the emerging market countries which have had a history of military engagement or strong military oversight. The militaries tend to be separated from civilian government, and the military does its own thing, including its own financial matters. So there's some of the anomalies that occur, but generally most Western type countries have a very strong accountability for their military, even if they have excessive expenditure. And the classic case is again the US, where we do through their congressional inquiries learn about some of the abnormalities and practices of their military expenditure. Again, makes a lot of interesting reading. Now these are some of the key regulatory, we mentioned all these before, the different professional bodies and stock market. And one that we're going to come back to later, the Corporate Governance Council, when I give you a lecture in a few weeks on corporate governance. Now, these are things that we've talked about in general up to now. What we're trying to do with our accounting standards, and keep in mind that I picture the accounting standards as being a component of a good corporate governance system. So corporate governance is all about the integrity of the organisation, and what part of that integrity is being able to report reliably what the organisation's been doing. So that's what we were talking about earlier, ex post, what did the organisation do in the last period? But also good governance is also should be forward-looking as well to build that. Now what has been one of the arguments is that the financial markets have not been well informed. There's been a lack of good quality information, and that's led to a lack of integrity in the financial markets and lack of confidence. And so there's been a big push to make sure that we have good information in our financial markets. We've seen a lot of pressure, and some of the buzzwords are openness, transparency. So we talk about transparent financial statements. So what that means, what do you think transparency means?
You mean in accounting?
Yeah, in accounting context, explain, give me in your own words.
Well, you just expect like all the figures, numbers, data to be true, and like that they could get, like you could get them easily from the company, for example, all the income statements and the data up there would be true. Like it's not fraud or anything.
Okay, yep. You have other ideas? What's the opposite of transparent then? What's the kind of opposite type word? If something's not transparent, what do we say it is? Okay, that's transparent to see clearly. So you normally use transparent when we look to a window, a piece of glass, don't we? It's transparent, we can see through. So it's as though if I look out the window and I see some trees in a garden, that's exactly what's out there. But we say it's opaque when it's not transparent. It's opaque. we can sort of see some light out there, and it's a bit blurry or foggy, you know. You often go to a bathroom, have a bathroom, it's all, but so you can't see what's happening inside the bathroom. Okay, or inside your house, okay? So, you know, transparent, but you have these issues, you know, what's transparent, what's okay. But let's think about financial statements. When we talk about them being transparent, we'll go back to our old equation. Assets equals liabilities. Now what's in our assets? We've got some cash, some inventories, some receivables, we've got some property, plant, and equipment, land and buildings, some intangibles. We've got all these things. They're all physical assets, aren't they? Or many of them are. Some are financial assets, a mixture of financial and physical assets. What we do is transfer all of those into a common element, a monetary unit, a dollar amount. So we say, okay, so we've already got a fair bit of fog there already. If we say we've got land and buildings worth 50 million on our balance sheet, what does that mean? Does it mean we've got a factory, a hotel, some housing estates, some real estate? What does it really mean? It doesn't really tell you a lot. So we talk about this as, oh yeah, it's really clear, we can see out there, it's perfect. But my point I want to emphasize to you is that accounting by its very nature is quite opaque. We translate everything to a monetary unit. Then what do? Then we have a whole lot of assumptions about this monetary unit. We say, oh, we're going to use historical cost. Oh, but that's a bit old, so we can do some asset impairment testing. Oh, that's not quite right, so we'll do some depreciation or amortization. So we take some numbers that may have arisen as a result of a transaction or some other event, and then we massage them in some way. And then we add them all up as though we can add them up. We assume we can add these numbers up. That's a real big problem in accounting, because we've got some cash, which is today's cash. We've got some inventory that we got last year, still sitting on the books. That's last year's dollar value in inflation or deflation. We've then got some receivables. Maybe we've adjusted the receivables for some doubtful debts. We've also got some property, plant and equipment. We've depreciated that. We've got some land and buildings we've adjusted. We've got some intangibles we've amortized. We've got all these numbers all derived at different points in time. And we assume we can add all of these dollar numbers together. This is one of the criticisms that we have of conventional accounting, that it is additive. We pretend it to be additive. Now that's a big assumption, and a lot of people have criticised the additivity of financial statements. And then we do all sorts of other tricks with them. So my point to you is that this notion of transparency is very complex. It's not simple, and I would hypothesize that virtually all financial statements are opaque. In fact, I would suspect many of them are what we would call dark. You know what they call space? Something like 90% of our universe is made up of dark matter. We can't even see it. The scientists tell us it's there, but they can't even figure it out. My hypothesis is that 90% of financial information is dark. We don't know it's really there. We don't know what's there, no matter how much is dressed up as though we do know it's there. Okay, there's a lot of opaqueness and darkness to financial statements. Now, one of the other things that we know, and one of the more interesting areas that I've done a lot of work in, is about our accountability of our company directors, executives and managers. Because nearly all of those guys and girls get paid vast incomes based on the earnings of their company, based on these accounting rules. And we know that in the financial industries, many of these people take home incomes in excess of 100 million. In fact, one guy I read recently had $150 million paycheck, and he was the 29th ranked hedge fund executive. So 150 million only got you ranked number 29th in the world. To get near the top, you certainly had to earn well over $1 billion income a year. So the income of many of these people are extraordinary, and it makes a lot of news now. And of course, as a result of that, we had a lot of change. So I was on Carmack a couple of years ago, I mentioned to you, and one of the things we brought in was greater disclosure of executive remuneration. And the government brought in last year the 2 strikes rule. So shareholders now get to vote at the meeting. You got paid $5 million, we don't think you earned it, we actually object to your executive compensation. 2 strikes and you're out. So the federal government brought in rules, much tougher rules on executives. Australia has very tough rules on executive remuneration. The US has no such prohibitions, and in some other countries there are various rules. But Australia now has some of the strictest rules on executive compensation and executive disclosure and things like that. So whether that's good or bad is an issue, because one of the things we do know is that executives are highly mobile. If I'm the CEO of a company, I can get a job anywhere in the world usually, particularly if you're good at it. These guys can jump on a plane. The guys that run the big companies here, they can go to Europe, London, France, America, anywhere. And we see them, executives, particularly the top level ones, move around the world, 3 to 4 years in each company. They have fairly high turnovers. They're highly mobile. So the question that we often ask is and this is one that comes from the executive side, is we need a free market in executive talent. We can't have too much regulation on executives because they'll just pack up and go and live in another country. Whether that's true or not, we'll wait and see. So anyway, we need, again, try to build high degrees of confidence. But there's a lot of interesting research, and one of my PhD students currently researching, looking at executive remuneration practices in Australia, UK and US. Because one of the hypotheses is that if you pay executives based on corporate earnings, so this overcomes some of our agency problems, then you align the executives to shareholder goals, you should get better performance. So the key issue to investigate is, does executive compensation align to corporate performance? And then the question is it a lead or a lag indicator? So if we pay an executive $5 million this year, does that actually improve their performance next year? Or is that $5 million a consequence of what they did previously? So it's based on prior, it's a lag indicator, or is it going to tell me, oh, I'm paying him $5 million this year, therefore I expect higher profitability next year. So understanding those relationships and getting data is really important. It's a big issue all around the world. It's very complex, mainly because executive compensation is extraordinarily complex. This set of notes you've got here, 200 or 300 pages. If you want to be a CEO of a company, your contract of employment will possibly be that big, maybe even longer. Very complex. I have never sat in on a CEO negotiation, but as part of our work in Carmack, what we did was we went to a lot of the employment recruitment guys in Sydney, Melbourne, and we found out, how do these people get recruited? And they said, well, we never see the person. The company brings in its team of lawyers, maybe a dozen. The CEO brings in their team of lawyers, maybe a dozen, and they sit next to each other for a month or more and negotiate a contract and terms and conditions. Then the parties go away, and the lawyers for the CEO will report back. The company's lawyers go back to the board and say, this is the terms and conditions, and then they reach an agreement. There's usually a mediating party called a remuneration consultant who sits in the middle, and the REM consultants work out, facilitate that with the lawyers till they get a contract and a set of terms and conditions. But you've got all these great things like, there's the big sign-on bonus. Some companies want you, they'll give you 5, 10 million, maybe in shares or options, up front. This is your sign-on bonus to get you into the company. Then if you're going to get kicked out early, you got your golden parachute. We don't like you. Okay, well here's 15 million, just go. Okay, so they've got all these really amazing terms and deals and conditions all built into their contracts. And of course, huge degrees of secrecy and confidentiality surrounding all that. But our legislation now is forcing all of these things out into the open. Only trouble is they're impenetrable. Nobody can read them. The remuneration report is required to be disclosed. Many companies now produce remuneration reports 50, 60, 80 pages long. even the experts can't understand them. They don't know exactly what's going on, what was paid for what. Remuneration for a CEO can span over many years, have a lot of different indicators along it. It's not just cash, it's shares and options and other benefits that are built into their packages. Very, very complex stuff. But fascinating area of accounting, research and corporate strategy. Because again, CEOs and the remuneration, they set strategy, they drive the company. We talked a bit about rules versus principles. And generally that's sort of a divide. You have lots of specific rules, or do you say these are the general things we're going to do? And as I indicate here, we look at around, there's usually a bit of a mix. Australia is seen as being more on the principle side, although at the present time we do have lots of rules. The philosophy behind principles-based approach to accounting regulation is that you don't create the big rule book that I talked about with the SEC in the US. Lots and lots of rules. And if you have rules, every time you have an issue, you've got to have a rule about that. If you don't have a rule, then no one knows what to do. So the general idea with principles is if you have a general principle, that should apply everywhere. The question then is how do you interpret that principle, how do you apply it consistently? And particularly when you move into an international context where you have different interpretations, different cultural contexts and judgments, and different attitudes towards risk and risk aversion and uncertainty. These kind of things are critical. So you can have a look and think about those sorts of approaches. The US is seen as a bit of a rules-based sort of system. Certainly following Enron, we had Sarbanes-Oxley, you know, the SOX Act. Sarbanes-Oxley, the big piece of legislation, particularly Section 404 on internal control. And I was just talked to Jung. Did I talk to you and refer to you the conflict minerals?
Yeah.
1502 in the Dodd-Frank Act. That's the latest one that came out following GFC. Now that's a fantastic piece of stuff if you ever want to look at something. You know conflict minerals? You heard of Blood Diamonds?
Oh, yeah.
Famous movie, Blood Diamond. What's the guy? Anyway, top Hollywood actor was played that guy in that. But what's happened now, the US is requiring any company dealing with the United States to certify that it has no benefits or no use of conflict minerals in any of its business operations anywhere in the world. So this is a really powerful, another powerful piece of legislative intervention that's going to affect people, well, drug smugglers, weapons, illegal weapons, or because these companies that may have used conflict minerals as a euphemism for blood diamonds, these now are going to need to be accounted for properly. I think something like, was it 1,500 pages of regulation about this. They estimate $16 billion, and it's all got to be audited. So huge growth industry for accounting regulation. I think this only came out last couple of weeks, so it's a new regulatory environment in the US, and we've got the SEC's interpretation of how they're going to implement the blood diamond or conflict minerals rules. And again, expanding. Who does all the work for the CIA today? The accountants. They are now the frontline people in a lot of the stopping international terrorism, stopping illegal money flows. It's all about tracking the money. Trace the money, control the money, and that's the philosophy. So again, a high level of rules-based approach in the US. This table here just summarises some of the accounting rules in Australia. You don't have to memorise all this stuff, but it gives you a picture that things are happening all the time. Every few years there's new reports, new updates and things to our governance laws. We're going to come back and look at these, but this just highlights some of the issues around corporate governance, the key issues. I won't read them out, but you can look at those. Key thing from an accounting point of view is having integrity in financial reporting and timely disclosure, keeping the market informed. And then this one here, I talked about executive remuneration, this general catch-all phrase of remunerating fairly and responsibly. And that's in response to some of these huge excessive compensations. And these next couple of slides just go through those sorts of issues on corporate governance. This is what's happened in the UK. Again, the UK has tended to be a bit of a leader, particularly in corporate governance. And Cadbury Commission is a very important foundation document there. Turnbull, Smith and corporate governance codes updated regularly. And critically in Australia, what I learned from my time in Canberra working with the government is that we are very close followers. I knew about this beforehand, but when you actually see how it works, Australia really looks to the UK for guidance on where it's going, on what we do in this country. This is some of the key stuff in the US. Critically, Sarbanes-Oxley. More recently, we should put in Dodd-Frank Act. Really important development last couple of years. That's just an overview of some of the various forces impacting on corporate governance around the world. And what I want you to be able to do is understand what is good corporate governance, how you get there, and how would you help a company have good corporate governance, and how would you manage a corporate governance portfolio for a company. We look at different types of issues about corporate governance. So we're going to come back and talk a lot more about this in a week or so, a couple of weeks' time. I see the key actually is strategy. It's often not emphasised, but the way I understand organisations to work is strategy is the driver. That will take you through to performance, and then you have your internal control systems to make sure you stay on track. The accounting profession is a big part of our regulatory environment because the accountants actually get involved everywhere. They're active. And the accounting profession, it grew up from the 1880s in Australia, from the 1910s and 20s. Its sort of roots, although most organisations claim to have originated in the 1880s. But most modern contemporary accounting, probably in terms of practice, didn't evolve until after the 1960s, till it became a university entry course. Accounting is a university, requires a university degree in virtually all countries of the world. In the early days, 50, 100 years ago, it was by practice. You went and worked with an accountant, did an apprenticeship, and then you became an accountant. Nowadays, it's higher level, and in many countries you require a master's degree, not just a bachelor's degree. So there's somewhere between 4 and 6 years of study to minimally meet educational entry levels, and then there's ongoing professional development. So it's a lifelong learning environment to try and keep. And as we've seen, because things are changing so quickly, you never ever get a day to go to sleep in accounting, okay? You've got to keep awake all the time. Boom, 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 you go to sleep 5 minutes and the world changes. So, quick work. Accountants argue about their professionalisation, and that's something that we want to have a think about. But the key things that you'll notice is education. But the more rules you have, the less professional you are, because all you've got to do is follow the rules, tick the boxes. If you leave it open to professional judgment, a principles-based approach, you are a much stronger profession. And also, in my opinion, you become much more innovative, which can be good or bad. It can create that risk, as we've seen with the GFC, but it also helps us respond and create to new opportunities. So my view is really less regulation, more innovation. And hopefully we manage that balance right and keep an oversight. And work obviously within a code of ethics that we're not really out there ripping everybody off. So there's a lot of issues around what the profession does and how it behaves, and some see that professional bodies as really just being self-serving, trying to control its own activity and maximise the income and benefits for their own people, for the membership of their group. So the more you can control the work, then you stop outsiders coming in to do that work, the higher you can price your work and the benefit. So this is this alternative view, which is more about accountants pursuing their own self-interest. Why are accountants different to anybody else? a fundamental belief from Milton Friedman and others is everybody follows their own self-interest. And I'm yet to meet somebody who says they're not following their own self-interest. So people are looking for their own interest. It may be to pursue money, it may be to pursue some other outcome. But self-interest is a key, assumed a key driver in all of our economic theory and practice in free market economic systems or in market-based economic systems. And the accountants should be doing that. There's no reason they shouldn't be doing that. But it's again a matching and controlling the power of the accounting profession with other groups. And of course accountants are fairly ruthless in taking out anyone who tries to compete with them. This raises the old conflict of interest argument that if accountants are pursuing their own interests, they may not be pursuing their clients' interests. So that leads to issues then about making sure we have professional codes of conduct and professional discipline committees to keep people within the right practice. And of course, if people do get out of control, people lose confidence in the accountants. They don't believe the accounting, financial reports, and then accountants become argued to be creative accountants and not to produce the useful information for decision making that they claim to. We've had the International Federation of Accountants, IFAC, emphasise these are the things that if we do all this, we should get accounting back into control. And there's a lot of work, and you should become familiar with those kinds of recommendations there. So this is just to wrap up then. When we look and talk about accounting regulation, there's a lot of forces. There's no one way, right way. It's competing, it's dynamic process, and it's alive. It's as we saw in this paper. It's happening every day. There's a legal case, a political decision, an economic decision, a corporate decision. Something's going on, and it's all adding to this side, that side of the argument. So this is constantly in movement, and as you become accountants, finish your degrees, you will no doubt get involved through whatever work you do in some aspect of this professional work, and the way it responds to that. So there's a lot of what I said here, this debate about reducing red tape. There's a big catchphrase, great for politicians. Oh, I'm cutting back red tape. They like to do that. And the final point I want to just leave you with is this, what I call asymmetric nature. We talked about doctors, lawyers, aircraft, airlines and pilots and various other things. The people who know what's going on are the accountants. They have all the information, the inside knowledge. Those in the inside, and then you've got the general public out there, don't know much going on. So this information asymmetry is huge. Those people with all the knowledge in any professional group have much more insight, much more ability to control the agendas and influence things than those who are outside. So that's an important point to recognise, and that does tend to lead to regulatory capture. So do you have any